certain words must be undertaken with great care. One should not simply assume that one's own understanding of a particular word or particular expression is what the other party means by it. Active listening requires questioning to understand the meaning of the other party's expressions. Secondly, the second tip for effective negotiation includes focus on interests rather than positions. Let me clarify. Your client has interests. Your government has interests. But those must be distinguished from the public positions that a business client or a governmental agency or a nation state takes. The interests are the ultimate goals. The positions are simply the opening expression of those goals. The difference between the two is important to understand. Thirdly, and this is probably more relevant to Americans, but perhaps not, negotiations is not a debate. You're not there to somehow win by out-arguing the other party. No, you are there to resolve a problem. The problem of the price of the goods to be sold, the problem of the exchange of information, proprietary information protected by IPRs, problems of nuclear weapons. You're negotiating on behalf of the government. You're not there to win, you're there to solve that problem. And it's important to look to objective criteria for guidance. If we look only to our client's interests for guidance, it will be very difficult ultimately to arrive at a consensual solution. There must be points of view founded perhaps in natural justice, perhaps in international treaties, perhaps in binding law that binds parties in both countries. There must be objective criteria by which to resolve, to bring to conclusion a matter. Let's move on here. I'll briefly move more quickly here with just a few points from each of my slides in the interest of time. There will clearly be at least one and perhaps dozens of issues that are confronted in the course of negotiations. How those issues are framed is extremely important. Are they described in terms, can we say these are substantive matters, for example, the price at which goods are going to be sold? Or are they less substantive matters, procedural matters, that have to do with simply the choice of law to govern any dispute that might arise if there is one? Let's move on to another one here. Negotiating ethics. This, I believe, is very important as well. In my opinion, it's a matter of simple natural justice that is unethical to lie about a fact relevant to the negotiations, what we would call in the American language a material fact, or to lie about the requirements of the law. While it is true that lying, I believe, violates any sense of justice, and it is in fact violative of the American rules of professional conduct as they apply to attorneys, what is a material fact, of course, can be understood differently. What is an untruth about that material fact can be understood differently. So even though we may agree, and I hope we do, that we should never lie in the context of negotiations, we must come to an understanding of what the other party's understanding is of what is material, what is a representation, what is a lie, and what is a falsehood. Number two, very important here, negotiating ethics do not require us to disclose all information. Now, if you remember one of my earlier slides, I said that a problem-solving approach to negotiations involves the disclosure even before the negotiations begin, but the disclosure of a substantial amount of information about one's own party's position. But even the problem-solving approach does not mandate that one disclose everything about one's party's position. In other words, if I am the seller of goods, and I'm representing the seller of goods from America to a buyer in Taiwan, my client has a range of values at which it is willing to sell grocery store refrigeration equipment, by way of example. Well, I cannot lie and say my client will not accept below a certain price. I'm not obligated to disclose at the outset the lowest price at which my client is willing to sell. So we have to understand that ethics prohibit lying. Ethics do not mandate full disclosure. Go to the next one, and this is a bit of a footnote here, and this, I want to reaffirm this point. Speaking as an attorney admitted to practice in several American states, I am subject to rules of professional conduct. Should I violate one of those rules, I can be subject to discipline, sanctions, ranging from a reprimand by the disciplinary authorities to disbarment, to losing my license to practice law. And one of those obligations I undertake is not to disclose confidences of my client without the consent of my client. So therefore, as an American attorney, I am duty-bound not to disclose information unless my client consents to that disclosure. I suspect, as a general principle, that applies in any context, in any country. Let's move on to the next one here. If you are negotiating with Americans, I'll just give you a few tips. I've already mentioned that not all Americans are competitive in their negotiating style, but there are certain matters that are consistently true of Americans in general. That is, punctuality is important. We do show up on time, and we become very upset if the other party does not. And I don't know the full ramifications of the culture here. I suspect that Americans and Taiwanese, Chinese might find this to be very consistent, perhaps not. Americans, number two, might display, the rest of the fact might display a greater difference between American culture and Chinese culture. Americans believe in speed and efficiency. Therefore, when we meet for negotiations, Americans come in, with the anticipation of the very briefest social formalities, sitting down immediately to discuss the most substantive issues, and remaining at the negotiating table until every single issue is resolved. Now, of course, in some transactions, everyone understands a single set of negotiations is possible, but nonetheless, the American